The morning air felt heavy at Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly by the tall windows of the oak room. Her fingers traced the cool glass, while she watched the early mist settle over the grounds where she had walked countless times with Queen Elizabeth II. The phone call had come just hours before dawn, and though they had been preparing for this moment for months, nothing could have readied her heart for the reality of it all. William found her there, still in the clothes she had thrown on hastily when the palace staff had knocked on their bedroom door. His own eyes carried the weight of sleepless hours, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from emotional overwhelm. They had been through so much together over the years, but this felt different. This was the end of an era, not just for the royal family, but for the entire nation. "The children are still sleeping," William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He moved to stand beside his wife, their shoulders almost touching, but not quite. There was something about grief that made even the closest people feel like islands, separate and alone despite being surrounded by love. Catherine nodded, unable to trust her voice just yet. She had always been the strong one in public, the Duchess who never let her composure slip during official engagements. But here, in this private moment, she felt the full weight of what they were about to face. The cameras, the crowds, the expectations that they would somehow embody the nation's grief while managing their own. She loved this view, Catherine finally managed, her words creating small clouds in the cool air near the window. Remember how she would stand here during Christmas morning, watching for the first guests to arrive? She always said she could tell someone's character by how they walked up the drive. William smiled despite himself, the first genuine expression to cross his face since the terrible news. His grandmother had indeed been full of such observations, small wisdoms that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. "She would have something to say about how we're handling all this," he said, knowing it was true. The palace had already begun the careful choreography that follows such moments. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their faces solemn but determined. Phones rang constantly in distant offices, as protocols that had been planned for decades were finally put into motion. Yet for William and Catherine, time seemed to move differently, as if they were caught in a bubble where normal rules didn't apply. "I keep thinking about George," Catherine said, finally turning from the window to face her husband. "How do we explain this to him? How do we help him understand that great-granny isn't coming back, but that he'll carry a part of her with him forever?" It was a question that had been weighing on both of them. Their eldest son had formed such a special bond with his great-grandmother, one of those magical connections that sometimes skip generations. Queen Elizabeth had delighted in George's curiosity about everything from the horses at Balmoral to the intricate details of state ceremonies. She had been teaching him about duty and service in her own gentle way, through stories and small responsibilities that felt like games to a young boy. William ran his hand through his hair, a gesture Catherine recognized from their university days when he was wrestling with difficult thoughts. "I think we tell him the truth," he said slowly. "That losing someone we love is the hardest thing we'll ever do, but that the love doesn't go away. It just changes form." The sound of small feet in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep and her favorite stuffed animal clutched tightly in her arms. She looked between her parents with the intuitive understanding that children sometimes possess, sensing that something important had shifted in her world even if she couldn't name what it was. "Mummy, why are you awake so early?" she asked, patting across the thick carpet in her bare feet. Catherine knelt down to her daughter's level, pulling her into a gentle embrace. The familiar weight of her child against her chest provided a moment of comfort in the storm of emotions. "We got some sad news last night, darling," she said carefully. "Great-granny has gone to be with great-grandpa Philip." Charlotte pulled back to study her mother's face with the serious expression she wore when trying to understand adult concepts. "Is that why your eyes look different?" she asked with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes when we're very sad, it shows in our eyes." William joined them on the floor, creating a small circle of family intimacy in the grand room. These were the moments that mattered most, he realized. Not the official duties or the public appearances, but these quiet exchanges where love was shared and difficult truths were faced together. "Will we still go to Balmoral for holidays?" Charlotte asked, her practical mind already working through the implications of this change. "Yes," William assured her. Great Granny would want us to keep making happy memories there. She loved seeing you play in the gardens and help feed the corgis. As if summoned by the mention of their routine, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of George and Louis, both looking sleepy and confused by the unusual early morning activity. The family gathered together on the comfortable sofa, William and Catherine flanking their children as they began the difficult conversation that would mark the beginning of their journey through grief. Outside, the world was already beginning to stir with the news that would soon dominate headlines across the globe. But inside the Oak Room at Windsor Castle, a family simply held each other close and began the process of saying goodbye to someone who had been the cornerstone of their lives. The quiet parting Catherine and William shared in those early morning hours was just the beginning of a journey that would test their strength, their marriage, and their ability to lead a nation through its own grief while navigating their own profound loss. The palace corridors buzzed with controlled urgency as Catherine made her way to the private dining room where breakfast waited, largely untouched. The familiar routine of family meals felt strange now, as if they were all playing parts in a play that had suddenly changed scripts. George sat quietly at the table, his usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence as he processed the morning's revelations. "Mama," Louis said, climbing into Catherine's lap with the easy confidence of a child who knows he will always be welcomed. "Why is everyone walking so quietly today?" Catherine smoothed his hair back from his forehead, buying herself a moment to find the right words. Even the staff, usually warm and chatty with the children, had adopted the hushed tones that seemed appropriate for such a day. "Sometimes when something very important happens, people speak more softly," she explained. "It's a way of showing respect." William appeared in the doorway, his phone finally silent after hours of constant calls from officials, family members, and government representatives. The weight of responsibility was already settling on his shoulders in a way that Catherine could see clearly, even if others might miss it. He had always known this day would come, had been prepared for it in theory, but the reality was proving to be something entirely different. "Uncle Harry called," he said quietly to Catherine, his voice carrying a complexity of emotions that she understood without explanation. The relationship between the brothers had been strained for some time, but grief had a way of cutting through other concerns, at least temporarily. "Is he coming?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer from William's expression. "He's making arrangements. Megan will stay with the children." William sat down across from his family, reaching for his coffee cup but not actually drinking from it. "It's going to be complicated." Catherine nodded, understanding the layers of difficulty that lay ahead. The funeral would be watched by millions around the world, every gesture scrutinized and analyzed. The family's private grief would have to be managed alongside public expectations and media attention that would be unprecedented in scope. George looked up from his barely touched breakfast. "Will there be lots of people at the funeral?" he asked with the practical curiosity that characterized his approach to understanding adult situations. "Yes, quite a lot," William answered honestly. "People from all over the world loved Great Granny and they'll want to say goodbye too." "Will I have to wear my smart suit?" George continued, and Catherine felt her heart squeeze at the way her young son was already thinking about his role in the proceedings. "We'll make sure you're comfortable," Catherine assured him. "This isn't about looking perfect. It's about honoring Great Granny's memory." The morning progressed with a series of small decisions that felt enormous in their emotional weight. Which photographs should be released to the press? How much should the children be involved in the public ceremonies? What traditions should be honored and which should be adapted for modern times? Each choice felt like a step further away from the private family life they had always tried to protect. Sir Clive Alderton, the Queen's former private secretary, arrived mid-morning with a leather portfolio that Catherine recognized immediately. It contained the detailed plans that had been refined over years, the careful choreography that would guide them through the coming days. Yet even the most thorough planning couldn't account for the emotional reality of what they were experiencing. "Her Majesty left specific instructions," Sir Clive said gently, settling into a chair across from William and Catherine, while the children played quietly in an adjoining room. "She was very clear about wanting the ceremonies to be meaningful but not overwhelming, especially for the younger members of the family." Catherine felt a familiar tightness in her throat. Even in death, Queen Elizabeth was still thinking about others, still trying to make difficult situations more bearable for those she loved. It was so characteristic of the woman who had guided Catherine through her own journey from commoner to future queen with such patience and wisdom. She also left personal messages, Sir Clive continued, producing a smaller envelope with Catherine's name written in the Queen's distinctive handwriting. She asked that these be delivered today before the formal preparations begin. William received his own envelope, and they exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. The Queen had always been thoughtful about significant moments, but this level of preparation spoke to how much thought she had given to her final goodbye. Catherine opened her letter with trembling fingers, aware that she was about to read words that had been written specifically for this moment. The Queen's handwriting was as neat and precise as always, and her message was both deeply personal and characteristically practical. "My dear Catherine," it began, "if you are reading this, then the day we have all known would come has finally arrived. I want you to know how proud I have been to watch you grow into your role, not just as William's wife, but as a mother and a future queen. You have brought such joy to our family, and your strength will be needed more than ever in the days ahead." The letter continued with specific thoughts about the children, advice about handling the media attention, and personal memories that made Catherine smile even through her tears. But it was the final paragraph that broke her composure completely. "Remember that grief is love with nowhere to go, but that love never truly disappears. It transforms into the strength we need to carry on the work that matters. Take care of William, take care of the children, and take care of yourself. The nation will need your grace in the difficult days ahead, but your family needs your heart. Both can coexist, as you have shown me time and again. With all my love and deepest gratitude for the daughter you have become to me." William looked up from his own letter to find Catherine crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she held the precious words. Without hesitation, he moved to sit beside her, pulling her into his arms as she allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of their loss for the first time since the phone call. "She knew," Catherine whispered against his shoulder. "She knew exactly what we would need to hear." They sat together in the quiet dining room, holding each other and the letters that represented a final gift from the woman who had shaped their lives in countless ways. Outside, the world was beginning to gather for what would be one of the most watched events in modern history. But inside, two people who happened to be members of the royal family were simply trying to find the strength to face tomorrow, while honoring the love they had shared with someone truly extraordinary. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that would change the entire emotional landscape of their grief. Catherine was in the garden with Charlotte, both of them finding solace in the simple act of tending to the flower beds that Queen Elizabeth had loved so dearly. When she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching Windsor, "That sounds like Papa's helicopter," Charlotte observed, looking up from the daisies she had been carefully arranging in a small bouquet. Catherine shielded her eyes against the sun, watching as the aircraft settled on the familiar landing area. She wasn't expecting King Charles until the evening, but grief had a way of disrupting even the most carefully planned schedules. What surprised her was seeing not just Charles emerge from the helicopter, but also Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Sophie. "They've all come," Catherine murmured to herself, feeling a mix of comfort and apprehension. The gathering of the full immediate family meant that serious decisions needed to be made, and she knew that emotions were running high for everyone. William appeared at her side, having spotted the helicopter from his office window. "Dad called an emergency family meeting," he explained quietly. "There are some complications with the arrangements that need to be sorted out before tomorrow." As the family gathered in the blue drawing room, Catherine was struck by how different they all looked. These were people accustomed to public appearances, to maintaining composure under the most challenging circumstances, yet today they simply looked like a family in mourning. Charles, in particular, seemed to have aged years in the past day, the weight of his new responsibilities evident in every line of his face. "The Prime Minister's office has made some suggestions about the funeral arrangements that I frankly find unacceptable," Charles began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of his new position but also the strain of his grief. "They want to limit the family's presence in the procession, citing security concerns." Anne leaned forward, her expression fierce with the protective instinct Catherine had always admired about her. "Mother specifically requested that all the grandchildren who wanted to participate should be included." That includes George, and I won't hear of him being excluded for political convenience. It's not about politics, Edward said carefully. The security services are genuinely concerned about the size of the crowds. The estimates are unlike anything we've seen before. Catherine felt William's tension increase beside her. This was exactly the kind of situation they had hoped to avoid. Family unity fractured by external pressures at the worst possible time. She glanced toward the door where she could hear the distant sounds of the children playing, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the heavy discussion taking place. "What does George want?" Catherine asked quietly, her question cutting through the debate. "Has anyone actually asked him?" The room fell silent. It was such a simple question, yet it highlighted something important that had been overlooked in all the official discussions and security assessments. George was not just a symbol or a protocol requirement. He was a 9-year-old boy who had lost his great-grandmother and might have his own feelings about how to honor her memory. "You're right," William said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "This is about honoring Granny's wishes, but it's also about what's right for our children. George should have a choice." Charles looked at his son with something that might have been pride mixed with exhaustion. "Bring him in, then. Let's hear what he has to say." When George entered the room, he seemed smaller than usual among all the adults, but his bearing was unmistakably royal. He had clearly sensed the seriousness of the gathering and had composed himself accordingly, standing straight with his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded Catherine painfully of Queen Elizabeth herself. "George," Charles said gently, kneeling down to be at eye level with his grandson, "we're talking about the funeral arrangements for Great-Granny. There's a question about whether you should walk in the procession with the family. It would be very public with lots of cameras and people watching. No one would think less of you if you preferred to participate in a different way." George considered this seriously, his young face reflecting a maturity that seemed both admirable and heartbreaking. "What would Great-Granny want?" he asked finally. "She would want you to do what feels right to you," Anne answered before anyone else could speak. She never believed in forcing anyone to do something that made them uncomfortable, especially children. "But she also believed in duty," George said, surprising the adults with his understanding. "She told me that sometimes we do things not because they're easy, but because they're right." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes again. Her son was navigating this impossible situation with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years, clearly drawing on lessons that his great-grandmother had taught him during their quiet conversations at Balmoral and Windsor. "I want to walk," George said firmly. "Great-Granny was always proud of our family. I should be there to show that I'm proud of her too." The decision settled something in the room, a sense of rightness that transcended all the political considerations and security concerns. William reached for Catherine's hand, squeezing it as they both recognized the moment when their eldest child took another step toward understanding his future role. "Then we'll make sure the arrangements work," Charles said simply. "The security services will have to adapt. This is about family, not politics." As the formal family meeting concluded and the relatives began to disperse to handle their various responsibilities, Catherine found herself alone with Charles for a few minutes while William took the children upstairs for their afternoon rest. "He's so much like her," Charles said quietly, watching through the window as George helped Louis navigate the garden steps. That combination of thoughtfulness and determination, she would be so proud. Catherine nodded, thinking about the letter upstairs that had arrived with such perfect timing. "She knew," she said. "Somehow she knew exactly what we would all need to hear when this day came." "She spent 70 years preparing for it," Charles replied with a sad smile. "Even at the end, she was still taking care of all of us." The afternoon shadows were growing longer when Harry finally arrived, his appearance creating a new dynamic in the family gathering. The tension between the brothers was still palpable, but it was muted by the shared grief they were all experiencing. Catherine watched as William and Harry exchanged a brief embrace, the first physical contact they had shared in months. "The children should see their uncle," Catherine said to William later, as they prepared for what would likely be another sleepless night. "Whatever else is happening between you two, they've lost their great-grandmother. Family should be together." It was another quiet moment of wisdom, the kind of practical emotional intelligence that had made Catherine such an effective bridge between different factions of the family over the years. William nodded, understanding that she was right, and made his way to find Harry for a conversation that was long overdue. The evening brought an intimacy that Catherine hadn't expected. After the formal meetings and difficult decisions, the family found themselves gathered in the smaller sitting room that had always been Queen Elizabeth's favorite for informal moments. Someone had lit a fire despite the mild weather, and the familiar scent of wood smoke mixed with the lingering fragrance of the Queen's favorite flowers created an atmosphere that felt both comforting and achingly nostalgic. Catherine sat curled in the corner of the sofa, watching as George and Harry played a quiet game of chess at the small table by the window. It was a scene that would have delighted Queen Elizabeth, her grandson and great-grandson absorbed in the strategic game she had taught them both, their recent awkwardness forgotten in the concentration required by the ancient moves. "Your move, Uncle Harry," George said solemnly, his small hands carefully adjusting a knight on the board. Harry studied the position with exaggerated seriousness, making theatrical faces that earned him a giggle from Louis, who was supposedly napping, but had crept back downstairs to be part of the family gathering. "You're getting too good at this, George. Great-Granny taught you well." The casual mention of Queen Elizabeth created one of those moments where conversation paused, not from awkwardness, but from the collective recognition of absence. Catherine noticed how each family member processed it differently. Charles looked toward the empty chair where his mother would normally have sat during such gatherings, while Anne simply smiled at the memory being shared. "She always said chess was like being a monarch," George continued, moving his piece with careful deliberation. "You have to think about everyone else on the board, not just yourself." William, who had been standing by the fireplace, turned at his son's words. "When did she tell you that?" "Last Christmas when we were at Sandringham. We played every evening after dinner while you and Mama were putting Louis to bed." George looked up from the chessboard, suddenly seeming very young again. "She said I needed to practice thinking like a king, even if it would be a long time before I needed to." The weight of that statement settled over the room. Queen Elizabeth had been preparing George for his future role in her own gentle way, using games and conversations that had seemed like simple enjoyment, but had actually been lessons in leadership and responsibility. Catherine felt William's emotional response even from across the room. The idea that his grandmother had been quietly preparing their son for responsibilities that seemed impossibly distant was both touching and overwhelming. She rose from the sofa and moved to stand beside her husband, offering silent support through her presence. "She did the same thing with William when he was young," Charles said quietly, "and with me decades before that. She understood that the best lessons are the ones that don't feel like lessons at the time." Sophie, who had been quietly helping Charlotte with a puzzle on the floor, looked up with tears in her eyes. She had such a gift for knowing exactly what each person needed. "I remember when I first married Edward, I was terrified of making mistakes. She told me that the only real mistake would be trying to be someone I wasn't." The sharing of memories created a warmth in the room that had been missing all day. Catherine realized that this was what Queen Elizabeth would have wanted. Her family together, supporting each other, finding comfort in the love they shared rather than drowning in the magnitude of their loss. "Mama used to say that grief was love with nowhere to go," Anne added, her typically practical voice carrying unusual emotion. "But sitting here tonight, I think she was wrong about that. The love doesn't have nowhere to go. It goes into how we carry on, how we treat each other, how we honor what she taught us." Charlotte abandoned her puzzle and climbed into Catherine's lap, her small warm body providing immediate comfort. "Mummy, will you tell us a story about Great-Granny?" she asked in the sleepy voice she used when fighting bedtime. Catherine looked around the room, seeing the expectant faces of both children and adults. They were all, in their own ways, children tonight, people who had lost someone, fundamental to their understanding of the world and were looking for comfort wherever it could be found. "I'll tell you about the time Great-Granny taught me to drive the land." "Rover at Balmoral," Catherine began, settling Charlotte more comfortably against her chest. It was a story she had never shared publicly, one of those private moments that had meant so much at the time and now felt precious beyond measure. "This was before you were born, George, when Daddy and I were still engaged. I was so nervous about everything. The engagement photos, meeting all the family, learning all the rules and protocols. Great-Granny could see how overwhelmed I was, and one afternoon she simply announced that we were going for a drive." William smiled, remembering. I came back from fishing to find both of you covered in mud and laughing like school children. She insisted on teaching me to drive the estate vehicle, Catherine continued, even though I already knew how to drive perfectly well. But that wasn't the point. We spent 3 hours bouncing around the Scottish countryside, and she told me stories about all the places we passed. By the end of the afternoon, Balmoral didn't feel like this grand, intimidating estate anymore. It felt like home. What did she say to you? Charlotte asked, her eyes heavy but determined to hear the end of the story. Catherine thought carefully about how to share the most meaningful part. She told me that home isn't about the building or even the place. It's about the people who love you and the memories you make together. She said that as long as I remembered that, I would never truly be lost, no matter how complicated things became. The room fell quiet except for the gentle crackling of the fire. Louis had finally succumbed to sleep, curled up on the rug with his head pillowed on one of the corgis that had wandered in from the kitchen. George had abandoned his chess game to listen to the story, and even Harry seemed more relaxed than he had been since arriving. She was right about that, Harry said quietly. No matter what else has happened, this family is still home. William looked at his brother, and Catherine saw something pass between them. Not a complete reconciliation, perhaps, but an acknowledgement of the bond that grief had temporarily strengthened. They were both mourning the same person, both facing the same fundamental change in their understanding of family structure. The children should remember this, Catherine said softly. Not just the grand ceremonies and official responsibilities, but these quiet moments. This is how she would want to be remembered, surrounded by family, with stories being shared and love being expressed without reservation. Charles nodded, looking around the room with an expression that mixed sadness with deep gratitude. Tomorrow will be for the world, he said. Tonight is for us. As the evening wound down and the family began the process of saying goodnight, Catherine found herself thinking about the remarkable woman who had brought them all together. Queen Elizabeth had understood that the strength of the monarchy didn't lie in its grandeur or traditions, but in the very human connections that bound the family together through both celebration and sorrow. Tonight, sitting in the warm glow of the fire with people she loved, Catherine felt that understanding more clearly than ever before. The morning of the funeral dawned crisp and clear, as if even the weather understood the significance of the day. Catherine woke before her alarm, finding the space beside her empty. William had risen even earlier, unable to sleep through the weight of what lay ahead. She could hear the distant sounds of preparation throughout the castle, the careful choreography that had been planned for decades finally being set into motion. In the nursery, she found William helping George with his formal uniform, their heads bent together over the complex array of buttons and insignia. Father and son looked remarkably similar in profile, both carrying the same expression of serious concentration mixed with underlying emotion. The jacket feels heavy, George said quietly, adjusting the unfamiliar weight of the formal military-style uniform that had been specially tailored for the occasion. That's because it carries the weight of history, William replied gently, smoothing a wrinkle from his son's shoulder. Great-Granny understood that feeling. She carried it with grace for 70 years. Catherine watched from the doorway, struck by the significance of the moment. This was more than a father helping his son get dressed. It was the passing of understanding from one generation to the next, the quiet transfer of knowledge about what it meant to serve something larger than oneself. Mama. Charlotte appeared at Catherine's elbow, already dressed in her somber navy coat, and holding the small posy of flowers they had picked from the garden the day before. Will Great-Granny be able to see us today? It was the kind of question that could break a parent's heart. Innocent, direct, and impossible to answer with certainty. Catherine knelt down to Charlotte's level, taking her daughter's hands in her own. I think she'll see us in the way that matters most, Catherine said carefully, in how we take care of each other, how we remember the things she taught us, and how we carry on the work she believed was important. The morning progressed with the surreal quality that accompanies long-anticipated events. Breakfast was largely ignored, replaced by endless cups of tea and quiet conversations. The palace staff moved with efficient solemnity, their own grief evident, but carefully contained out of respect for the family's needs. Catherine found a few moments of solitude in her dressing room, applying makeup with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. The black dress hanging behind her was beautiful in its simplicity, chosen specifically because Queen Elizabeth had once complimented Catherine on it during a state dinner. Even in her choice of funeral attire, Catherine was honoring their relationship. A soft knock interrupted her preparation. Anne entered without waiting for permission, her own formal attire making her appear more official than usual, but her expression carrying unusual warmth. "I wanted to give you this before we left," Anne said, holding out a small jewelry box. "Mother specifically requested that you wear it today." Inside was a delicate brooch in the shape of a flower, diamonds set in platinum with an elegance that spoke of another era. Catherine recognized it immediately from countless photographs. Queen Elizabeth had worn it during some of her most important public appearances over the decades. "I can't," Catherine breathed, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "This is too precious, too important." "Mother was very specific," Anne said firmly, taking the brooch from the box and moving to pin it to Catherine's dress. "She said you would understand its meaning better than anyone, and that the nation would need to see that continuity today." The weight of the brooch against her chest felt significant, like a physical reminder of the responsibility she was accepting. Catherine looked at herself in the mirror and saw not just a woman preparing for a funeral, but a future queen taking another step toward fully embracing her role. "She saw something in you from the very beginning," Anne continued, adjusting the brooch's position with careful precision. "That strength you show when things are difficult, that ability to make people feel comfortable and valued. She knew the family would need those qualities, especially today." The drive to Westminster Abbey was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced. The streets were lined with people as far as the eye could see, all standing in respectful silence as the funeral cortege passed. Many were crying openly, their grief for Queen Elizabeth mixing with their recognition of the historical moment they were witnessing. George sat between his parents in the car, his young face serious as he watched the crowds through the bulletproof windows. "There are so many people," he whispered, his voice carrying a note of wonder mixed with apprehension. "They loved her too," William explained quietly. "She belonged to all of them, not just to us. Today is their chance to say goodbye." Inside Westminster Abbey, the gathering was extraordinary. Heads of state from around the world, representatives of every major religion, ordinary citizens who had been honored with invitations. Yet despite the grandeur of the setting and the historical significance of the moment, Catherine found herself focusing on the smaller, more personal details. The flowers on the coffin included sprigs of rosemary from the gardens at Windsor, picked by the family the previous evening. The music included hymns that Queen Elizabeth had specifically requested, pieces that had special meaning for her faith and her understanding of service. Even surrounded by pomp and ceremony, the service remained deeply personal. When the time came for the procession, George walked between his parents with a dignity that made Catherine's heart swell with pride and break with emotion simultaneously. Her 9-year-old son was handling this impossible situation with a maturity that honored both his great-grandmother's memory and his own character. The moment that would be remembered by millions came as they exited the Abbey. Catherine and William paused at the top of the steps, their children beside them, as the coffin was loaded onto the gun carriage for the final procession to Windsor. In that instant, surrounded by the weight of history and the expectations of the world, they shared a look that captured everything: their love for Queen Elizabeth, their grief at her loss, their commitment to each other and their family, and their acceptance of the roles they had been born or married into. It was a moment of pure human emotion amid all the ceremony, a glimpse of the real people behind the royal titles. The cameras captured it, and the image would become one of the defining photographs of the day. Not because it showed grandeur or majesty, but because it showed authentic grief and love. As they began the final journey to Windsor, Catherine felt Queen Elizabeth's presence in the most unexpected way. Not in the elaborate ceremony or the global attention, but in the way George reached for Charlotte's hand during a particularly emotional moment, in the way William's shoulders straightened with resolve, in the way the family instinctively drew closer together when facing difficulty. These were the lessons Queen Elizabeth had really been teaching all along, not about protocol or duty in the abstract, but about the very human ways that love expresses itself through service, how families support each other through loss, and how individuals can find strength to carry on even when the task seems impossible. 3 weeks after the funeral, Catherine found herself back in the oak room at Windsor Castle, standing at the same window where this journey had begun. The world had moved on with remarkable speed. News cycles had shifted, tourists had returned to their normal visits, and the intense global focus had naturally diminished. Yet for the family, the real work of grief was just beginning. The children had returned to school, their teachers briefed on how to handle any emotional moments that might arise. George had thrown himself into his studies with an intensity that worried Catherine slightly. He seemed determined to excel at everything, as if academic achievement could somehow honor his great-grandmother's memory. Charlotte had become more clingy, seeking extra hugs and reassurance that the people she loved weren't going anywhere. Louis, too young to fully understand what had happened, simply knew that the adults around him were sadder than usual. "The thank you letters are finally finished," William said, entering the room with a stack of correspondence that represented just a fraction of the condolences they had received. Messages had come from every corner of the globe, from world leaders and celebrities, but also from ordinary people who had felt compelled to share their memories of Queen Elizabeth or express sympathy for the family's loss. Catherine turned from the window, noting the exhaustion in her husband's face that hadn't been there a month ago. The public duties had resumed almost immediately after the funeral. There was no extended mourning period for working members of the royal family. Life and the expectations that came with their roles had continued relentlessly. "Some of them are quite moving," William continued, settling into one of the comfortable chairs by the fireplace. "A woman from Australia wrote about meeting Granny during a state visit 40 years ago. She remembered every detail of their conversation, how Granny asked about her children and her work. It lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it clearly meant the world to her. It was so typical of Queen Elizabeth, Catherine thought, the ability to make every interaction feel meaningful, to treat each person she met as if they were the most important person in the room at that moment. It was a gift that had served the monarchy well for 7 decades, and one that Catherine was still learning to emulate. "Charles wants us to take on more of the international visits," William said carefully, watching Catherine's face for her reaction. "The calendar is quite full for the rest of the year, and he feels we should maintain the momentum of public engagement." Catherine nodded, understanding the reasoning even as she felt the weight of additional responsibility settling on her shoulders. The transition period was proving more demanding than anyone had anticipated, with public interest in the royal family remaining intensely high, even weeks after the funeral. "What about the children?" she asked, voicing the concern that never left her thoughts. "George is already struggling with the attention at school. More high-profile trips means more media coverage, more disruption to their routines." It was the eternal balancing act that defined their lives, the tension between public duty and private family life, between serving the nation and protecting their children's childhood. Queen Elizabeth had managed it with apparent ease, but Catherine was discovering that the reality was far more complex than it had appeared from the outside. The sound of running footsteps interrupted their conversation, and George burst into the room with an excitement they hadn't seen from him since before the funeral. "Mama, Papa, come quickly. There's something you need to see in the garden." Curious and relieved to see their son showing genuine enthusiasm about something, William and Catherine followed him outside. What they found took Catherine's breath away. The formal flower bed that Queen Elizabeth had tended personally for decades was blooming in an extraordinary display of color and life. Roses that shouldn't have been flowering so late in the season were in full bloom, and the entire garden seemed more vibrant and alive than it had been in years. "The head gardener says he's never seen anything like it," George explained breathlessly. "He thinks Great Granny must have done something special to the soil before she couldn't garden anymore." Catherine knelt down among the flowers, breathing in their sweet fragrance and feeling an overwhelming sense of presence. Whether it was coincidence, careful gardening, or something more mystical, the explosion of life in Queen Elizabeth's beloved garden felt like a message, a reminder that love and care continue to bear fruit long after the gardener has gone. "She would have loved this," William said softly, his voice carrying the first note of genuine joy Catherine had heard from him in weeks. "She does love this," Charlotte corrected seriously, having followed them into the garden with Louis toddling behind her. "Just because we can't see her doesn't mean she's not here." It was the wisdom of childhood, simple and direct in a way that cut through all the complex emotions the adults had been struggling with. Catherine pulled her daughter close, marveling at how children could sometimes understand profound truths that escaped their elders. That evening, as Catherine helped tuck the children into bed, George asked the question she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Mama, do you think I'll be a good king someday?" Catherine sat on the edge of his bed, choosing her words carefully. "I think you'll be exactly the kind of king Great-Granny would want you to be," she said finally. "Someone who cares about people, who listens more than he talks, and who understands that being a leader means serving others, not being served by them." "But what if I make mistakes?" George persisted, his young face serious in the dim light of his bedside lamp. "Everyone makes mistakes, darling. Even Great-Granny made mistakes. The important thing is learning from them and always trying to do better." Catherine smoothed his hair back from his forehead, the same gesture she had made countless times since he was a baby. "But you don't need to worry about being king for a very long time. Right now, you just need to focus on being 9 years old." Later, as Catherine and William walked through the castle corridors toward their own room, they passed the portrait gallery where generations of monarchs looked down from their gilded frames. Queen Elizabeth's official portrait had been hung in the place of honor, her familiar smile seeming to follow them as they passed. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing it right?" William asked suddenly, voicing the insecurity that Catherine knew he carried but rarely expressed. "All of this, the public duties, the way we're raising the children, the decisions we're making about the future of the monarchy." She made it look so effortless, but I feel like I'm constantly questioning everything. Catherine stopped walking and turned to face her husband, seeing in his expression the same uncertainty she felt herself. "I think that's exactly what makes you the right person for this," she said. "The fact that you care so much about getting it right, that you're constantly thinking about the impact of your choices on other people. Great-Granny had that same quality. She never stopped learning, never stopped trying to improve." They stood together in the quiet corridor, surrounded by the weight of history and the expectations of the future, but finding strength in their shared commitment to the values Queen Elizabeth had embodied. The quiet parting they had shared in those first moments of grief had evolved into something deeper, a partnership tested by loss but strengthened by their mutual understanding of what they had inherited and what they owed to the memory of the extraordinary woman who had guided them both. Outside, the gardens of Windsor Castle settled into peaceful darkness, the flowers that had bloomed so unexpectedly, continuing to release their fragrance into the night air. In the castle itself, a family slept more soundly than they had in weeks, having finally begun to understand that grief and love, endings and beginnings, could coexist in the same space, and that Queen Elizabeth's greatest legacy wasn't the crown or the ceremonies, but the very human capacity for resilience, service, and hope that she had nurtured in all of them.